And there we go. So we're recording this session. All right. What's this? Again, this is easier than classroom, right? You could all chime in and say, why, Pete? It's a windmill. So yes, it is. It's a windmill. Okay. But that's what it is. It's a windmill. But is it a windmill? Is it a lawn ornament? That's a windmill. Is it a piece of infrastructure pumping water in the Netherlands? Is it an obstacle on a mini golf course? Until you put context with it, your windmill is just a windmill. And I need to understand why you think this thing, in this case, this problem that you have, is truly that, a problem. So for the purposes of wargaming, and particularly at the college, we're trying to wargame to help a sponsor fill in the blanks around a question. They've got an issue, they have a problem, and we're going to try to design a game that helps somehow inform that problem and hopefully make it less of a problem. All right? But until I understand the problem, I'm going to have a very difficult time crafting an activity that really gets at it. And this is kind of where, again, we have our first problem, why we bucket this together with problems with sponsors and problems in general, is this is probably one of the first things you're going to have to engage a sponsor on is what exactly is the problem that we're trying to address. So from our work, we've come up with this kind of this problem definition in terms of it's a problem is a set of circumstances. It's the nouny thing that usually people first identify. There's a problem, okay? Something is leaking, it's my mother-in-law, it's something. There is a thing, something tangible typically or condition that they say is the problem, but there's more to it. Because apparently that situation, condition, or person is having an undesirable effect on preferred outcomes. So the three parts that I want you to think about when we say problem statement is that you're thinking about a circumstance which creates an undesirable effect versus a preferred outcome. 3 parts, all right? And these 3 parts are important. Then as you cascade along and start to develop towards gaming objectives that you think is going to aid the sponsor. Another way to schematically kind of represent this is this kind of little pictograph here thing, where there's something, some sort of obstacle, something, okay, which is causing a bad thing to happen, step 2 there. But what you really want to do is get over here to step 3. So all of these pieces together start to form a problem. So this is my local Rhode Island story. Around here, you have the state constitution guarantees you the right to get to the beach, okay, to access the shoreline. Now, there's some issues with what defines the beach. And obviously there's a constant tension between the people who want to use the beach and the people who own private property abutting the beach. So let's take an individual who says, there's a fence across the beach, and that's a problem. Well, I don't know, it sounds like a fence. Usually fences are solutions. I don't understand how your fence is a problem. So why is your fence a problem? Well, because of where we park on the street, and I've got my kids, and I got all the crap they want to take to the beach, and so we got stuff in baskets, and we got to drag the cooler, and I got the baby, and we all, and we have to go, and if the fence is there, we have to go all the way down to the other end, come up across the dune access, and walk all the way back up the beach to get to where we want to be. I go, oh, I'm starting to understand this a little bit more now. That barrier is causing you adverse effect in terms of delay and physical exertion. Trying to get the stuff to where you want is a quick and easy path from where you park to the sand. That's the exact same fence. If I ask the homeowner, he'll say, oh no, the fence is a solution. Because people keep traipsing across my private property to get to the public part of the beach. And I want to keep them off my property. It's just a fence. But until we put it in that context of those 2 people, it's not a problem. Another quick story. Membership on a church advisory board, and at one of the meetings, someone said, we need a second service. I went, and lots of people were going, oh, yes, second service, second service. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, why do we need a second service? And right away, someone chimes in, first service is getting crowded. So parking is becoming a problem. and we got people parking on the street, and we'd rather not have them park out in the street. So we just need to kind of thin the herd on Sunday morning by having maybe an earlier service at 8 and then the regular another service at 10. That'll reduce things. That's why we need a second service. And suddenly someone else goes, whoa, no, what? Say, no, that's not the problem. The problem is that kids who are in athletics can't come in the times we're scheduling it now. So we need to have it like on a Saturday night option so that people who can't make Sunday, period, it doesn't matter whether it's 8 o'clock or 10 o'clock, it's still in the morning, they need to be able to come Saturday night for services. That's why we need the second service. Whoa, no, that's not why we need a second service. We need a second service because the service right now is very traditional, and it's a turnoff for younger people. So we need a more contemporary service for younger people and the more traditional one for people who want that. All of them now have worked this backwards from my initial example with the fence is the fence represented the problem, trying to understand why it's problematic. Here we have people who've jumped to a solution, 2 services, and I'm having to work backwards to find out that they don't have the same problem. But all of these share this dynamic of people saying something and assuming y'all know what we mean. And we're all of the same mind, so you ought to understand my position on this. An argument is, no, not unless you start to draw it out for me, and I have to pick at it. Do I really begin to understand what it is you're trying to get at? All right. So another kind of useful use of the problem statement, as structured as we had that 3 parts, is that if you break it down like this, so we've gone from our picture to our now kind of a fill in the blank thing. So you got something, and it's resulting in a frowny face when you'd prefer to have a happy face. But as you start to pick at these, okay, so the very first thing is when people tell me that something is problematic, I have to wonder, well, how do you know that? I've had the chief of naval operations tell me that something was broken, and I asked him, well, how do you know? And he's like, well, it just is. Help me understand the evidence that has brought you to this conclusion so that if I'm going to try to game at it, I understand the relevant things that went into your thinking. But you just can't say, cause. And likewise, I need to understand that, at least in your mind, what's the causal chain? You're claiming that this thing is causing a problem for you. Okay? This is the things like, again, these are some of the logic fallacies that come out, where this idea that, well, Bob is the problem because everything was fine until Bob got here. All right. Well, how do you know that actually Bob is the source of the problem? There might be some correlation, but causation? But I need to understand that in the problem statement structure that you're telling me something is causing you pain, some sort of negative effect, versus what you'd prefer to have happen, okay? So, and this is the only thing. This is it. This is the sole source of your problem is this one thing. It's nothing else contributes to it. Well, let's pick it apart a little bit. And we're going to have to try to explore and understand this a little better. And this whole bad thing, good thing sounds wickedly subjective. So does everybody agree, back to the beach problem, right? Does everybody agree that this is quote unquote problematic? And why is it that getting to the thing you want is so important that you've got to find a solution to the first thing? You've got to find some way to start to picking apart this so you can get to 3. Because one of the approaches, as you ultimately start thinking about problem solving in the context of whether a game is necessarily the right vehicle, is look at our bottom thing here is, well, can I just change the desired outcome? My little picture of a wall and someone trying to get to the other side of the wall is only a problem if getting to the other side is what you want. If you don't want to get to the other side of the wall, I could care less. It's not a problem. The wall is still there. The wall hasn't gone away. The thing still exists, but it's no longer causing a negative effect for me because I don't want what it impedes. But all of these become pieces parts that you can start to pick at to try to understand how a game might begin to approach the problem and see where it can explore, dig at. And is it by going after the barrier itself? Is it about somehow mitigating the negative effect? Or is it about simply changing what you want as a desired outcome? So all of these parts begin to start to kind of fill in our understanding of the problem. And from earlier discussions, we kind of talked about thinking about how things are linked together as a part of game design. Usually a sponsor will come at you with the initial problem definition, and it's relatively narrow, not well defined, and kind of narrow, because it's what he sees, and he hasn't thought probably hasn't thought deeply about it. So there it is, and it's kind of this little, well, this is connected to this, and this is my problem. But as you go on and start to do some of your research and you start kind of digging more into it and asking why is that important? Well, how is that connected to this? Why does that matter? And you kind of just probing the problem. Okay, you start to realize that a lot of stuff is connected together. And then to quote a colleague of mine, Stephen Downs Martin, everything is connected to everything. But at some point, that's not helpful, right? We used to joke, and I tell the story in the class that if you look at most problems in the world today, and you start kind of doing this multi-layer analysis, this 5 why analysis, root causal analysis, digging it apart, figuring out that this is connected to this, is connected to that, ultimately, all problems seem to converge as their source is my wife. Right? Now, she will sit there and tell you, now people are like appalled when I say that. I go, you don't understand. My wife is an attorney. And when she teaches the law, and all of her examples, where there's got to be some perpetrator who's committed some heinous crime, I'm the one who is always the perpetrator of the crimes. So she can be the source of all my problems. But in this construct now, we need to somehow get this narrowed down. Yes, we now more fully understand the problem space, but it's probably too big to tackle in a single game. So we're going to kind of, as we talked about in some of those earlier designs, kind of draw that box, begin to focus where we're going to look at stuff in the context of our problem. So we've gone from an initial space where the problem was fairly small. We've expanded it out, and now we started to contract it again. But this is still bigger than what we started with, but it's not as big as the entire universe. And it starts to inform that space, figuratively speaking, where we're going to try to build our game. Okay, where it's going to have its components and elements that begin to try to approach those pieces, parts that seem to define our sponsor's problem. So just to revisit this, because obviously I think this is important, this whole thing about objectives. And I can't understate the value of understanding the objective here. And you'll recognize this from a previous lecture we did, where games are typically defined by a purpose and an objective. And I find that people often blur these two. I find nothing more irritating than when I'm at someone's game and I'm sitting at the obligatory game in brief, and they're gonna have a purpose statement. And the purpose of this game is to explore something. And the objective is to explore it. It's like, well, you took out the word to, and that's about the only difference between your purpose and your objective. So I often put it in the military context, as obviously a lot of my customers are military. So I fall back on the commander's intent model of purpose, method, and end state in terms of why you're doing a military operation, how we're doing the military operation, and having successfully done it, what the world's going to look like at the end, so we know when it's over. So from this, if you try to align the two and answer the questions about why we're doing this game, how we'll do the game, what we expect out of the game, okay, then purpose pretty much so aligns with purpose. Why? Got it. That's why we're doing this. Why does this game potentially have value? Why? What are we trying to do? Now, if you then enter your objective, and you look at your objective, and your objective is verb heavy, those are action words, and I typically associate action with method. Okay, how we will do things. We'll investigate, we'll explore. How will method investigate or explore? We can get into more detail, and I'll talk about those words here in a minute, right? Rather than thinking from the objective being end state, because I would like to be able to know that we did what I said we were going to do. So the objective defines what it was I was expecting at the end of the game. Every board game, every other game has some sort of objective that the players understand what they're playing for. The objective of the game is to be the last person, the first person, the guy with the most, whatever it is, and it's a defined victory condition, which we all recognize, because otherwise it's difficult to play a game and not know if you won or not, because no one can recognize the victory condition because it's not in kind of end state language. And we expect those end states to be simple, measurable, actionable, relevant, and timely. The SMART objectives that we talked about before. And so the example I typically use here is this idea that again, this is very typical of an objective for some sort of war game, which is meant to look at operational plans or concepts, and it's like this review and discuss. Well, that's not what we're going to do. But how do I know I've actually done it and I've met the objective that the sponsor was shooting for? Because we can review and discuss and get nothing out of it and be no smarter than we were before we did the event. As opposed to here, the participants understand the interaction of all organizations during this execution, because now we've narrowed it into a very specific thing that is what it is I'm trying to get as a takeaway from this event. Often phrased as an expression we ask sponsors during some of the during concept development conferences, which we'll talk about here coming up. And it's this idea of, at the end of this game, this will be a success if, fill in the blank for me. okay? What it is that I'm trying to get to that you're going to look at and say, yes, that's exactly what I needed to get out of this, right? So explore, explore. Aren't these pretty pictures? Explore. Explore is just a pet peeve of mine, and I use it at the very beginning, all right, in terms of exploring something. Is in terms of, I think it's a weak objective word. People will use this all the time. Explore something. Now, probably what they mean is we don't understand the thing we're trying to get a better understanding of, and the process of going from not understanding to understanding is exploration. Okay, but if I were to try to be I'm an adventurer, and I want people to sponsor my exploration of the Amazon, and I'm trying to get people to fund me, and having gotten a bunch of money, I fly to South America. I start there at the mouth of the Amazon, and I wander about 100 yards into the jungle. I look around, and I come out. I have explored the Amazon. You can't say I didn't, because I had no other definitions of success. Now, if I had told you that I needed to explore the Amazon in order to find the headwaters, in order to understand the hydrodynamics of the upper reaches of the river, to look at how deforestation is affecting the water quality in the Amazon River. All right, these are far more specific, simple, measurable, actually relevant, and timely types of objectives that would be way easier to design a game around than just, I want to explore. Okay, and only slightly better or worse, depending how you look at it, than explore is, this is where you have to guess. It's going to be dramatic pause. Investigate is equally as squishy as explore. So I'd rather people spend some time really sitting down with the sponsor, digging at what it is you think the objective of this game is going to be, because it's going to solve problems later, or try to at least mitigate problems you're going to have with the sponsor later. Very specific kinds of problems are coming up here in a moment. But again, I pick at objectives because it is the foundation of your game. And if you've got crappy objectives, then you're not going to have a good game fix bad objectives. Okay, you can have a bad game ruin good objectives, but it's difficult to have the work the other way around. And so at least now you kind of understand what it is that you and the sponsor together are trying to achieve in the language of outcomes that you're looking for that game to do. And it now gives you some ammunition to start batting back things that are going to inevitably come down the road. We're about to talk about these, which are quote unquote problems that come from typically the sponsor, all right? So let's first start about, sponsors. Oh, no, wait. Sponsors, there we go, right? And how you have to have this love-hate relationship with the sponsors. And typically, where a lot of your sponsor relationship is going to occur is at planning conferences. So let's kind of do a quick jog through why it is, how it is that we use planning conferences as a way to try to get to our game outcomes. And realize that, again, remember, I speak from kind of where I sit, where I'm typically dealing with large games, lots of moving parts, lots of people. And so these conferences tend to become kind of elaborate affairs. So what we're really trying to do, though, here is why we even bothered to do the planning conferences. And we've got very specific goals that are going to occur at the 3, maybe 4, if you do a concept development one, conference. What are we trying to get at? And a lot of it is kind of this ulterior motive that beyond what you're actually doing in the conferences per se, it's about maintaining the communications between you and the sponsor, right? About constantly managing expectations and making sure everyone's buying into what it is you're doing. And be careful on how much you want or need approval at different steps, okay? Because oftentimes I found that the sponsor does not fully understand what they want. We've been trying to do problem definition, and we've come up with something that we think is spot on, but we fail to convince the sponsor that this is really what you need. I know what you said, but this is what you need. And because we can't get past that point, they adamantly refuse to kind of approve what we want to do and force us to do something else, which is always dissatisfying. But it also reflects on the fact that we were unable to communicate effectively what it is that we thought we could get at. So there's other stuff you can always tack on to a planning conference. When we used to do these in person, we do almost all of these. Pre-COVID, we had gone to pretty much all online kind of events for these planning conferences. But if you are going to have an in-person one, we usually use the excuse of having gathered everybody up for what could be big, about a 2-hour meeting, to do other work. And that's to get stuff like scenario development, if you need to bring together those folks, or do some of the other issues you see in the latter part of the slide. All right, but what exactly you're going to do is obviously a function of the nature of your game. But one of the things that, regardless of big games, small games, defense games, whatever, is this tendency to what we call sprint and drift. Okay, this is particularly problematic of like large joint games, right? Where you don't have a keen sense, you got a single entity you're working with as a sponsor, you got multiple sponsors, even worse. All right, but it's this idea that the planning conferences are where all the work happens. And in between planning conferences, people don't do anything. So you had this frenzied activity for a day or two, trying to grind through stuff that's part of your intermediate, mid, or initial mid or final planning conference. And then nothing happens until the next one, except for a small team of folks who try to beaver along. So this sprint and drift pattern, we don't find to be terribly productive. On the other hand, if you approach the meetings like these are really those times to get public buy-in. We've been working with action officers and with intermediaries and executive agents all up to these points. And now these conferences tend to be more about gaining kind of a consensus view around what you're doing, as opposed to it is walking in and saying, okay, well, we don't have an objective or anything, so I guess we need to spend the next couple hours working on one. I've been to those, right? So the biggies that you typically see are concept development conference, the CDC, the initial IPC, the mid or main MPC, and a final planning conference. We tend to, from the college's perspective, try to get at using the first two really to nail down purpose and objective, okay? Such that then for the mid planning one, we're trying to get the design blessed so we can step out smartly into development. And at the final one, we're really just trying to tie up execution loose ends. The analogy we like to use is building a home, which I'll show you here kind of how that falls in. One of the things I just throw this in here, this idea about the JELC, the Joint Event Life Cycle. If you've got Department of Defense, Ministry of Defense customers who are used to exercise planning, right? There's a lot of commonality in the terms between the two. And this, you have to be conscious that if you're dealing with a military customer who hasn't had a lot of wargaming experience, but they've had a lot of exercise experience, the commonality of language will cause them to think that you're really talking about the JELC versus what you're trying to accomplish, which is a little bit different in a wargaming situation. So again, expectation management, agendas, telling people what it is exactly you're trying to get out of the events. So let's talk about the CDC real quick. So from the CDC, after the CDC, everybody involved should understand why we're bothering. Why are we going to have this game at all? Okay. Now, sometimes you'll end up having the CDC and the IPC kind of rolled together because you go from understanding the purpose right into objectives, or you can have kind of a bit of a break. If possible, we like to have a little bit of a break so we can go off and do some study and try to understand the purpose a little better, try to understand some of the initial bits that the sponsor has thrown out there as a problem, and maybe refine the problem statement a bit. All right. So really the sponsor at this point is kind of articulating their need. Okay. I need a place to live. I need something. I got a problem. All right. And that's kind of how this begins. There's a sponsor who wants. All right? And again, let me caveat something here, realizing that at the War College, we tend to be sponsor driven, as opposed to independent games, which are done for research purposes, for internal purposes within organizations. We tend to be more sponsor driven, as opposed to independent, using gaming in an independent research capacity. So there's almost inevitably a sponsor involved, okay? And if we can, we like to get right to the people who are going to be making the decisions. This is one of the problems you're going to encounter with sponsors, in terms of the sponsor may be U.S. Pacific Fleet Command, but you're not dealing with Admiral Aquilino, the 4-star. You're dealing with somebody in his exercise and gaming shop in the 9. And they can't make the meeting, so they send a deputy. All right, so already I'm multiple steps removed from the guy who wants the game. And this is potentially going to be one of your sources of friction, in terms of you thought you understood what the commander wanted, but quite frankly, you've never actually spoken with the commander. And you may have a very hard time getting to them, and we'll talk about why here in a bit. So from that, we can kind of move on from the definition of what your need is, what's the problem, to start kind of throwing out some broad pieces parts in terms of the objective, and kind of start to narrow that field. Remember, you kind of done a little work, you figured out your problem space, you made it smaller. And so in this case, we can start kind of putting some of the more concrete stuff down in terms of timelines and who's going to do what, who's got responsibilities for what, downstream conferences, kind of start working your plan, your POAM, your plan of actions and milestones that you lay out. And this is where you're really going to start to get the objective nailed down at the IPC. Coming out of the IPC, you as the game designer need to understand the objective now. What end state is it I'm trying to get the person to? We started off with they have a problem, they don't have housing, and we've decided that, well, there's a lot of ways to solve a housing problem. But it seems like through conversation that we've narrowed it down that what they need is a house, not an apartment, not a tent, not an RV. We're going to build them a house. And everyone's going to go, yeah, we think that's, yeah, okay, I'm good with that. We're going to build a house. Roger. We're going to step forward now with designing a house. So when we come to the NPC, we're looking for the sponsor now to agree that the game design we're about to pitch, or we've just pitched, okay, given the purpose and the objective, here's why we believe this game design will achieve the desired end state for you. Okay, I'm selling my design. I'm selling my blueprints here. Okay, I've got some beautiful architectural drawings and watercolors of this fabulous home we're going to build you. All right, and that's what I need them to bless at this point. Okay, and this is critical because at this point, me as the game designer, think of me as the architect. Okay. You've blessed my little artist conceptions. You've blessed my blueprints. And I'm now going to turn them over to the game development team, the general contractors, who are going to start to make this thing. And the more time that goes by after they start work, the harder it is to start to make changes. Because they're going to pour the foundation. They're going to start putting up the framing. And at some point, you suddenly say, whoa, hang on, I've decided I want a basement. I've already poured you a slab. There was no basement in the original design. So the sponsor needs to understand that at this point, change starts to get hard. And I'll show you why they don't believe this. Right? But that's coming. All right. So now having gone from that, hey, we're going to start breaking ground and we're going to build. You're good? Okay, we're all going off to build. When you get to the final planning conference, really this is where you get to tweak the edges. Okay. There might be some issues with some participants, and well, we thought we were going to get this person, but we're going to have to substitute that person. And it looks like we may have to move the final plenary an hour because of when the CNO's plane lands. But you're tinkering the edges. If you're at the final planning conference, and at this point, the sponsor kind of sits there, and this might be the first time the actual sponsor, right? The senior officer or the senior individual who kind of has that yay or nay authority actually shows up. Because now the game is pretty close. On the timeline, it's not that far away. And now they get involved and they sit back and they go, well, this isn't the game I wanted. Who came up with this? And of course, we look immediately at the action officers and they all suddenly play, oh, we don't know, sir, that's not, those game designers went off the rails. It's like, you son of a... So understand that, again, building these expectations for what's going to happen at each of these conferences leading up to the final planning conference can try to mitigate some of those whip snap problems you're going to get out of the sponsor. So let's talk about some things that the sponsor is going to do that are going to cause you heartache and pain in the process of trying to run a game. Okay. The first one has to do with the objective. Okay. They never really give you the objective. It becomes this bring me a rock drill, which is, again, I don't know what rock I want, but the rock you brought isn't the one I want. So go off and bring me some more rocks. And this idea that you've tried to communicate with the sponsor and you've sent up something to say, look, we believe that, because often you're dealing over email or video teleconferencing, you're not face-to-face with the sponsor or their immediate representatives who have the authority to speak for the sponsor, by the way. And they just don't answer. They, well, we'll have to take that up to the boss. We're waiting to hear back. Meanwhile, the clock is ticking. And if you had the luxury, and we at the college do not, if you had the luxury of being able to do all your planning from getting something and adding days. So when we get the objective, 30 days later, you'll get your NPC. When we have the NPC, 40 days later, you'll have this. That means that the game date keeps moving because it keeps getting pushed out. Right? Someone's late, someone doesn't give you something. We said, look, we said 30 days from when we get the objectives. The objectives were due last week. You just gave them to them this week. So everything's just moved a week. Yeah, sometimes you can get away with that. We can't because our schedules are so locked in. Our games are so jammed up against each other back to back that there is no slippage room. But it's beautiful you can slip because then it becomes on the sponsor because they failed to deliver necessary intermediate product to get you to your game on time. And again, silence from the sponsor should not be construed as consent. You send something that says, if we don't hear back, we'll assume that this is okay. Yeah, and you don't hear back, it's not because they're just saying, yeah, it was fine, we don't need to communicate with them. It's probably because they're ignoring you. And the reason they're ignoring you is what we call delayed interest. And you'll see this in a second. The other thing they have is scope creep, all right? Or this is what we call hanging one more ornament on a Christmas tree. So suddenly you have a game that you thought you drew the box, you expanded it, you contracted it, and you all got agreement that this is your game space. And now you get all sorts of people coming out of the woodwork who are kind of doing that. Hey, while you're at it, could you do this? Let's add this to the game. Let's tack some of this on. And sometimes a couple of things drive that. One is this idea called more bang for the buck. It's like, well, if we're going to have this game, let's get the most out of it we can. So aside from looking at this naval problem in the South Pacific, I'd also like to look at the geopolitical context of our struggle with the PRC and potential ramifications for a space war and what might happen to currency value in the United States 6 months after the fight. No, I get it, but we can't do all that, right? And then you got the WIFM problem. WIFM, what's in it for me? So you've gone and invited because you think it's a naval game, Naval War College. It's a naval game. We're going to have a maritime component commander, but by and large, we're not going to do anything in isolation. We probably need a significant air portion of the battle that's going to require Air Force participation in the real fight, and therefore we most likely are going to have some sort of joint Air Force component commander. So we want some Air Force representatives to come to the game to fill out that role for a Navy objective. The Air Force guys are going, well, what's in it for us? If we're going to come to this game, we're going to spend the money and the time to participate. We want to get something out of it. And what we've got is this brand new death ray thing that we want to have evaluated. And say, wait, what? No, what? No, we're looking at maritime posturing and deterrence model. And no, we need the death ray evaluated too. So you're going to have to go back to, and I'll show you a little template you can use maybe to help beat this back. But a lot of this is again, in the context of that expectation management. And the other part is what we call the more realism logic. You're going to hear this. Well, for this game to be more realistic, you need to include X because, that's what the enemy is going to do. Yeah, that's a possibility, but the game isn't designed to look at X. Yeah, but it's not going to be very realistic. I go, okay, hang on. So this is the example I use. Remember I said my wife's an attorney. So if you look at this, your immediate thought when you saw this picture pop up was it's a courtroom. It is, but it's moot court. So these are not practicing attorneys down there for the plaintiff and the defense and the front tables there. These are law students who are practicing being in the courtroom. So while it has many of the trappings of a courtroom, if you look carefully and you could see the whole room, you'd notice that behind that front bar are a bunch of other students sitting around in jeans and not typically the way you dress for a court. There's no jury. There's no bailiff. There isn't actually a defendant sitting in that chair. It's all co-counsel. Because what would be the value, let's take the bailiff. What would be the value of having a bailiff in here? Now, it would be more realistic, sure, okay. But what value does having the bailiff there under the guise of realism bring? If the objective of this exercise is for these law students to practice oral arguments before in this case, 3-panel judge. That's why there's no jury. Because of this particular moot court, a jury was not relevant to the learning objective. Now, if on the other hand, part of what I want them to understand is the security environment inside of courtrooms and what could happen if you have a unruly defendant or you have someone in the gallery, if a weapon is brought into the courtroom that got past security, and what could play out. Well, now the bailiff is crucial. He's a crucial element I need to add to achieve the objective of my game, not because I'm just trying to add quote unquote more realism. So we pick and choose the parts from reality. That's the whole point of having a game and not having an exercise in order to play the most effective game that we can. The other thing I hear a lot is that the sponsor will come in and I'll start with the scenario. I want to game this scenario. You say, well, hang on. What is it you're trying to learn? And we had a case where a sponsor had a very particular scenario in mind, but when we sat there and started doing the, well, why that scenario? Why is that important? What elements of this appeal to you? Why is it you came to this conclusion? And we began to realize that actually it was probably not the best scenario for them to use. And I don't think we've been, I've got a whole lecture on how do you think about scenarios and what the difference between what we call front-end scenarios and back-end scenarios and how they are they should all serve the objective, right? And that's what we call this getting the snare cart before the objective horse. The objective should be pulling everything along with it, okay? Now, it's often easier for the sponsor when you say about a war game and they think of a game, they think of the environment of the game. They think about where it's played. And this makes perfect sense. And this is actually a board game design consideration, in that usually a board game designer begins with an experience in mind. I want the players to have an experience through gameplay, which will lead them to an entertaining hour or a better understanding of thermonuclear war. But I start with that sense of an internal state that I want the players to come to. And now I'm going to make a mechanical thing, a game, if I'm making a board game, that I want them to experience. And so the end product of my initial, I have an idea for a game and I want the players to be able to do something, is now manifest in a box sitting at the shelf at my local hobby store, toy store. You as the consumer start with the thing, right? You're walking the aisle and you see this box and it catches your eye and you look at it and you read the box and you turn it over and you look at the objective and the artwork, and you're starting with where the designer ended, or the developer ended. Okay, and now you're going to take that thing and you're going to use it and play with it, and hopefully you will end with an internal state, an experience that the designer wanted you to have at the beginning. So it makes perfect sense why sponsors tend to come at things from the game end of it, and which is in the most manifest part of the game is the scenario set for it, versus the problem end of it. But we tend to spend an awful lot of time trying to get this. Okay, let's set that aside for a second. Maybe you're right. Maybe it is. Maybe a South China Sea scenario would be exactly what you need to look at. But let's try to understand some of the other possible elements to go into that. And we've successfully talked sponsors out of one scenario into another by showing them how this would probably better suit their needs. Rice bowls and pet rocks. All right, this is where it's pretty clear when you get somebody who has come to the game because, by God, they've got a message to push, okay, at the game. And usually the reason we pick at these is being problematic is the ones that fit within our play space we're happy to accommodate. It's usually stuff that doesn't. That's by definition what makes it a rice bowl or a pet rock. And we're not debating its importance. It's just not important to my sponsor potentially, or it's not important for me to get to the objective of the game. So oftentimes, and this is I'm gonna give away a secret here. The way you deal with rice bowls and pet rocks is called areas of interest. Now this is a little bit deceptive. Now I have future sponsors gonna watch this video and go, aha, that's what they're doing. When we do areas of interest as opposed to objectives, basically what we're saying is, look, we understand that somebody has an interest in this. And if in the course of play, we'll try to be sensitive to this. And if it comes up, great. But we're not going to design to it. So we park it off on an area of interest column. And that surprisingly appeases a lot of people. All right? So I may never get to your thing, but at least you saw it on a slide and you feel good. Oh, yes, I was on a slide. They took our recommendation on board, and they've included under area of interest a death rays. So we're covered. Okay, I don't want to say I'm trying to fool you or distract you or lie to you, but anyway, and we try to be honest and say, again, as I described it, if in the course of play, by the nature of the game, we stumble across some information that informs this area of interest, it's a win. If I don't, it's not a loss because it was never an objective to start off with. Now, I've lost this argument and it gets forced on me. So what do we have? Then we get the bolt-on. And the bolt-on is just that. It's something that I didn't want to put in the game, and I lost the fight about keeping it out. And I was told, shut up and color, put it in the game. Okay, these are typically 11th hour type things that get stuck. At best, you can try to, again, accommodate them in some manner, which will have marginal impact on your objective. At worst, it takes the train off the tracks. We had an event that we designed a game, and it was this large geopolitical top-down game where we were trying to understand ultimately, naval capabilities and capacities. But we started off kind of in a scenario planning kind of approach with alternate futures, and we went through this cascading process of saying, well, if that's a future, then tell me what the political, the PMESI kind of environment looks like, the political, economic, military, societal, infrastructure, and information environment looks like. And if that's the case, then what are the likely conflicts? And of those likely conflicts, which are the ones that per US national security policy, we're likely to get involved in because we don't get involved in everybody's problem. And of the ones we're likely to get involved in, what are the instruments of national power, DIM and E, that we might bring to bear? Of those DIM parts, what do we think the military contribution is to those? Within the military contributions, where does the Navy fit? Does the Navy have the capacities and capabilities to deliver? Woo! Big logical chain, big long deductive chain. It worked out nicely for us. The sponsor suddenly in the middle did one of these, hey, while we've got everybody together, we want them to evaluate some of these new concepts. And we went, wait, what? Did you not just hear my description of how this is all locked together? Yeah, but we think this would fit. It's not gonna fit. No, we want it in the game. Well, I don't put it in the game. All right, so we found a day where we carved out a chunk of an afternoon, and we kind of took somewhat of a pause, and we introduced these concepts and had players do some survey and evaluation stuff to it. At the end of the game, we usually do surveys about the game as a whole, asking players, feedback, what you think, insights from your participation, et cetera. And almost to a man, they all wrote down, hey, by the way, what was that thing that was wedged in on Wednesday? That didn't seem to fit. So players will recognize it. Sometimes you have to deal with it and there's no other way. We call these Franken Events, where it looks like you've cobbled together a bunch of disparate objectives and jammed them all under one umbrella, and it's a Frankenstein game. This is probably one of the bigger problems you're going to deal with, especially with large commands. And it's this delayed interest in the good idea train problem. And basically, at the college, now this isn't a problem if your kind of initialization to execution timeline is short. So if you're an organization that is able to go from, hey, you were contacted on the 1st of the month about doing a war game and you're doing the game at the end of the month or the next month, okay, you probably won't have as much of this problem. But because in my world, we're looking at like 6-8 month development timelines from, hey, I got an idea for a game to we're executing it. So 6 months, 8 months, okay? You try to get a command that is busy with the now and today to be thinking about a game they're going to be part of or sponsoring, at least on paper, 8 months from now, right? They're kind of disengaged. So early on, okay, we want my two curves here. Early on, I have a lot of flexibility because we're early in the process. Where'd my thing go? We're early in the process, okay? So I got a lot of time. I got a lot of flexibility, okay? But the sponsor's engagement level is terrible. They'll send the third lackey from the left to come to the meeting. As time marches on, remember we're starting to, okay, we've approved the design, we're pouring concrete. My flexibility is decreasing dramatically. But now as we're getting closer to the game, the sponsor's kind of starting to pay attention. And right about here, or actually right before the FPC, is where I said before, they suddenly pitch in with a bunch of ideas. Because now they're paying attention, because now the game is actually relatively close on their schedule, and now they're putting some effort to it. Unfortunately, the concrete is dried, and we've already framed the house. So to try to get past this, we constantly beat this drum about expectation management and how we need information, and how if we don't get this information, there's going to be a risk to pay downstream. All right? It's really hard to beat off the good idea fairies, unless you can put it in the context of how, yes, it's a wonderful idea. Let me explain the cost of putting that into the game at this point and how it could wreck an objective. And sometimes you can get them to say, oh, I kind of see your point. Maybe we won't do that. So ultimately, what can you do? Kind of a big wrap up here. Try to make sure you're dealing with as close to the senior decision maker in terms of your sponsor as possible, okay? And know their chain of command, right? Understand that if you're not dealing with the general, the admiral, or the senior executive, that the person you are dealing with is 1 below, 8 below. They have the authority to speak for them. They don't. Because that's going to kind of shape how you need to understand, oh, this guy said yes, but he was only a minion. I really like to try to get at least his boss to say yes too, and start to work that chain of command to get as close to the commander, if not the commander himself, involved in your problem statement definition, for example. Constantly manage expectation in terms of, this is what's coming up. This is where we are. This is where we're behind. This is what we need that we haven't gotten yet. This is the downside of not getting that. I understand the schedule's not likely to slip, but we're going to start to downscope what we're going to do within the time we have, and just keep beating that drum with them. I understand a lot of times you're going to feel like you're banging your head against a brick wall, and they're not taking it on board. But again, typically it's because this is your day job. It's not their day job. And while you've got an entire team able to devote to this problem as a wargaming institution, the War College, your sponsor's got a lot of other balls in the air, and trying to kind of get through to emphasize the importance of some of these early decisions can sometimes be hard. And as I just said before, explain in painful detail. Okay, I understand your good idea, but here's the cost of implementing that good idea. The more you can get people to publicly freeze and sign things, okay, like at the IPC for the objective. I have been able to win a few battles when we have been able to, when good ideas crept up later, said yes, but at the IPC, the objectives that were agreed upon by your command were these. And that doesn't fit what you're trying to do there. And I've got a couple of people back down because at least we were able to publicly demonstrate that, look, we had a giant meeting, everybody agreed. I'm sorry you missed that meeting, but this is the command's position on what the objectives are for this game. And so we like to have a paperwork trail. Wow, are they really reluctant to sign stuff? Okay. We got one where they just stonewalled forever. And in part, it was understanding command dynamics, because the issue here was, again, not dealing with the commander, but dealing with some subordinate levels within the organization. And their fear was that having signed their name to something, that if it went sideways, we could hold up a piece of paper and blame them. And so no one wanted to actually commit their names to the paper. But again, what you're trying to emphasize here is the importance of getting these things somewhat nailed down as soon as you can, and try to keep them nailed down. And again, if you're part of a larger organization and you've got bosses, always good to keep your boss in the loop and let them know that things are starting to go sideways. A lot of this from a project, this is really project management, right? A lot of this from a project management perspective is in our handbook. And I got to say, that's kind of what our handbook is the best at. Our handbook is not a great how to war game, you know, in terms of a design guide, okay, how to design a game, but it's pretty decent at, if you're an organization similar to us, large wargaming department, et cetera, big projects, then the guide does have some kind of milestones and examples of documentation from a project management perspective that tries to get you from beginning to end. But one of the techniques that I think you can always apply is this idea of just be the dumbest guy in the room. I do this all the time. It's plausible. And really what you're doing is you're just trying to use this as a mechanism to force people to explain things, okay? Force them to explain things. So I've often led from, and this is a typical facilitator technique, right? Where you sit there and say, okay, I'm not an expert in this field, so really help me to understand. Could you explain why? I'm probably the dumbest guy in the room. So could you go over this again? And I'm sorry if you're having to repeat yourself. Could you tell me one more time why? And you're really trying to get them to boil this thing down to brass tacks. And keep asking, anytime they make that declarative statement, don't just take it at face value. Start to ask, well, wait, why do you want to do that? Why is that important? Or why do we have to include these people? And when they give you an answer, say, oh, okay, help me understand how this supports our objective that we approved at the MPC, remember? Kind of thing. All right. So this is this little template I use typically for good ideas. And I try to make people understand, okay, so you're bringing me your rice bowl. And what I have to ask is, okay, so why is it you're bringing me this rice bowl? And if you tell me that the answer is essentially that it's going to help with your understanding or research question or objective, it might be I missed something. It's not like I do the most thorough literature review and I've caught everything. I may have missed something, and you may bring something and we may look at it and go, wow, you're exactly right. I don't know how we missed that. I didn't realize that agency had that important role in this type of problem sets. Let's see how we can fold them in. As opposed to the bailiff, right? You didn't put a bailiff in. I'm from the bailiff union, and you didn't put a bailiff in. Yeah, I don't need a bailiff. And what you're telling me isn't that the bailiff is going to help my research question or my objective. It's just trying to pad out the scenario. Okay. 2, okay, let's say we get past the first one. We say, yes, this looks interesting, this thing you brought me. Okay, but how does it actually manifest in the real world? Is this something that is only dealt with at presidential levels? And that, that's where it lives at the presidential level? Okay, but we're not playing at the presidential level. So how does that help? I mean, I get it, and I'm trying to understand how your thing lives, where it lives for real, strategic, tactical, operational. And even if it's at the, say, operational level, is a player, a commander, likely to be in a position to make a decision about this, or is he told this? in which case it sounded like something's coming out of white, or it's coming in an inject form. And I don't have much manipulation or control over it. Those aren't very interesting. Remember, we had our whole discussion about about decisions in games, and this doesn't actually support a decision in the game. I get it, and it would be part of it, but I need to understand how that's going to interact with the player world. And then finally, the real world. I'm trying to understand this from a real world context. And then finally, I'm in a situation where now I'm looking at it and I'm saying, okay, but in this game, given the constraints, and we're in McCarty Little Hall, we're somewhere that is an artificial environment. Can I even do this thing that you want to represent? And this is a good example of like where we get these cross-purposed objectives and things like, on the one hand, I'll have the sponsor say, hey, we really want to get into command and control in a comms denied environment. So, okay, roger that. He says, oh, and by the way, I also want to use this event as kind of a band of brothers event. And so I'd like to spend a lot of time talking with my subordinate commanders. Well, wait, are we comms denied or not? Well, yes, we are, but not for those guys. It's like, well, those are the only other players in the game. So, I mean, I can pretend that the little tiny widgets running around on the board are comms denied and have some rule sets for it. But I don't think that's what you wanted to get at to with the C2, D2E, comms, command and control in a comms denied environment. When it sounds like you have some commander's intent and issues and guidance issues you want to explore too. Is that the kind? Yeah, both. Okay, I can't emulate that for you in McCarty Little Hall the way we have it currently set up. So again, that's how we try to approach when people throw out these good idea stuff. We try to understand from okay, why are you trying to put it in? How does it work real world? And can I possibly represent it in my faux world of the game to the benefit of the objective? Last thing I want to pitch, two last things before we go for questions. I want to make a pitch for connections this year. All virtual, right? Those are the dates, 10 to 14 August. There's the link to go. I'll be giving a talk about pandemic gaming, as I mentioned when we were just chatting before we got started. And I'll also be kind of talking about the frameworks for thinking about distributed gaming as a separate topic. And then finally, there's a panel that'll be on distribution of games, thinking about gaming online, distributed gaming. What does that really mean? Pros and cons and difficulties in doing it. And some case study look at that. The last thing I do before we do Q&A, because Robert asked me to, is I do my game plug. All right. So my game plug this time is Bonanza, although almost nobody in the United States calls it Bonanza. It's a German game. We call it Beano. Beano is a card game. And as you can see here is my virtual background does crazy things with it. But it's a bean, okay? Bonanza is a bean farmer game. Now, my whole family, my in-laws, my parents, they all love to play Beano. It's a great card game that we'll play on the holidays around the table kind of thing. But when my sons, when they were in high school, tried to introduce this game to friends, and they would say, hey, we got this great card game. And they'd have to stop and say, okay, before I go any further, I understand the theme is stupid. It's hard to get worked up and excited about being a bean farmer. But the play mechanic is it's a card trading and trick taking game. And so it's an excellent game. It's just some of a again, not problematic, but the theme does not engender enthusiasm when you try to explain it to people. Yet it's an excellent game. So again, Bonanza is what you'll find it under, colloquially, typically called the Bean Game or Beano. So that it was my Fast and Furious. I think we got right at the top of the hour. So basically, we've got a 30-minute period for Q&A. I always kind of turn this back over to Robert to be the quasi-moderator for this.
Yeah, and I just ask people to, we've got a fairly small group, to raise your questions that you'd like to ask.
See, this one's not nearly as exciting as some of the other game stuff.
Well, I had one, and you probably covered it as one of your favorite questions was why. Did you have any other questions you kind of have in your pocket that you pull out?
Kind of, yeah. I mean, there's a set that Dr. Stephen Downes Martin uses, this idea about about what do you want, why do you want it, and how come you don't have it already, as kind of a structure to helping guide your discussions with seniors and sponsors, and trying to get them to articulate what exactly it is that's in their head that's driving them to want a game. So again, what do you want? Why do you want it? And why don't you have it already? And you weren't able to get this quote unquote on your own. This is usually my retort also to the realism part of it, where when people want to create an increasingly realistic environment, I usually stop and say, well, hang on. So there's nothing more real than reality. And current reality apparently has not informed your problem. So why would making a game look more like the thing that isn't working for you be beneficial? I kind of go, what? Says, yes, we're trying to construct an artificial world that allows us to dial up the focus on some things, dial down the focus on other things in such a way that we might learn something that we don't otherwise get at by just simply being in reality. There's the other questions, again, like dealing with again, seniors, what keeps you up at night? What is it that you're really worried about? Type of thing to really trying to understand the nature of their quote unquote problems. So what keeps you up at night? What do you want? Why don't you have it? Or what do you want? Why do you want it? Why don't you have it already? This game will be a success if, make them fill in the blank. And this phrased a couple different ways. At the end of this game, what is it I can put in your hand that's going to make you happy? You know, is it a game report that outlines the 6 major things that we found wrong with the plan? Is it a prioritized list of investments for the medical community? Those are all kind of questions that we use to try to steer the conversations, to try to find really what is it that players want, or sponsors want to get at. One of my metrics of failure is this idea that I don't want a sponsor to say, you know, that was a pretty interesting game, but it didn't help. Damn it. So I constructed an activity which apparently was entertaining or at least engaging on some level, but ultimately I didn't advance the ball any further down the field for the sponsor. Now, we may have learned a lot of secondary stuff and some oh by the ways and got at some of those areas of interest, but at the core, I really am, given my situation and how we're sponsor driven, trying to help the sponsor in some capacity. Even if that means telling them that, you know, that their widget, that the ideas they had that they brought to the game don't work. Okay, we try to be very intellectually honest with the sponsors in terms of how we're going to play the game, and we've had individuals from other services participating, like in our adjudication team, will watch us. You know, the sacred cow of the Navy tends to be aircraft carriers, and we'll sit there and the adjudication team will say, "Yep, the carrier got whacked." Okay, so the carrier's out of it. She's out of action, not sinking. It's hard to sink a carrier, but she's certainly no longer combat effective. And we'll have other services and look at each other going, "Well, just hit a carrier." Well, yeah, because that's what happened. Look where they put it. It's like, yeah, but if we were to shoot down like the Air Force's current pet jet fighter and any numbers more than about 2, we'd hear about it from our bosses. It's like, that's you. So again, you're trying to make sure that you're driving as much as possible towards those research questions that you have through all these conferences and constant conversations with the sponsor, or at least their immediate representatives, think is going to help them get a better handle on whatever their problem is. What else? Ooh.
So there's some comments in the chat area.
Yep. Oh, yeah, there is. Let me cut over here to John's comments. This is more. Yeah. Yeah, the overly complex problem. How do I simplify it? So typically what we try to do is with that, that mapping process in terms of sometimes, no kidding, creating a visual map. I don't know if I used the infamous Afghan spaghetti map, the K map from Afghanistan, conflict in Afghanistan, where consultant PA Consulting had developed that crazy complex map that everybody blamed PowerPoint somehow. It was PowerPoint's fault. And even Crystal was saying things like, "Oh, you know, PowerPoint makes us stupid." But it got at the complexity, whether you liked it or not, it demonstrated the complexity of the problem. And then when you start to literally show that type of complexity, and then you start to say, so for our game, which has to be bounded by some real constraints, time, time to play, number of people who can participate, facilities. We're going to find it very difficult to try to emulate all the nodes on this entirely complex diagram. So if we had to focus on one area, and we call this the player cross at the college in terms of understanding who really is your center audience, who's your central focus level. And a lot of times in, like in naval gaming, it tends to be the maritime component commander. If he's the center of the universe for the purposes of gameplay, then what either relationships, typically relationships or processes, somehow are kind of above him, beside him, and below him. Kind of making a cross here. To understand the kind of the in-do-out dynamics of that system. And you start to then decide, okay, so if it's important for that individual to be able to make decisions and they're being informed by these complex relationships, how important is it from a gameplay perspective that the next node, that the next dynamic piece in your system here is a thinking, freewheeling player? And if you say, yep, he's got to be a player because of the nature of the problem, we think that's really important that next link out is a player. Okay, you can keep doing this. Now, if they sit there and go, everybody's got to be a player, oh, you're back to your original problem. I haven't solved anything. Now you've come up with this Afghan war map that's going to need about 12,000 players. But as soon as you start to get a feeling that you're moving away from the center and you're starting to feel like, well, maybe that could be more white cell, perhaps, or just that's kind of, it tends to be rather inject driven, and you don't have a lot of control over that. Like, especially when you get into senior leadership levels. Okay, there's no reason to have to model the president to the SecDef relationship if the players have no control over that, and it's unlikely to matter whether it originated with the president or originated with the SecDef. All that's important is where that guidance then enters the game, and everything above it's kind of like, yeah, okay, whatever. All right, so maybe that's how you start to try to trim it down. But typically we try to start going the other way. I mean, this is like that classic brainstorming activity, right? You start with that initial nugget, you explode it out, and then you start to collapse back in. And you see about what you think you can manage. And sometimes it's just about the realities of time and space. We only got so much room, we only have so much time, we have a budget, we have a limited calendar. This is all we think we can bite off. And as soon as I draw that square, I have to account for everything that falls out beyond that square. But I don't have to game it with a bunch of dynamic players making decisions and all the overhead that comes with having players do that, as opposed to having that somehow shaped by potentially a white cell. And this is a separate lecture I do on the player cross and trying to understand how you build out some of those relationships. So really start from the center, work out until you start to feel like you're losing interest. Okay. What else do we have here? Oh, Rex. Joe, on game day. Yeah, I hate that. So fortunately, at some point you get to be a curmudgeon, and I've been accused of becoming the guy who starts to yell, get off my lawn. We really try to control, if they weren't part of the game, senior presence in the game. Now, sometimes we just distract them in terms of if they've come, and this was another old war gamers aphorism about every alligator needs to be fed. So nobody comes to observe a game. Observe. And that somehow that is to you just supposed to mean, oh, don't worry about them. They'll stay out of the way. They're just going to walk around and watch. Even if a senior officer says nothing and walks into a room, he's changed the dynamics in the room by his mere presence. So we try to understand who is going to show up and really craft activities that if they're not part of the gameplay, then sometimes we call them the flag concierge, that has to come up with flag entertainment activities to distract these people so they don't mess with my game too much. That's why we typically have in all the rooms, facilitators, strong personalities, who have been blessed by their chain of command to be able to eject people forcibly from a room. We do, again, I benefit bizarrely from being at a university, not just dissimilar to Rex, in terms of the idea of academic integrity and academic freedom. So Chatham House rules and those sorts of things. But we tend to have a fair amount of support from my chain of command to be able to forcibly eject people regardless of rank under the auspices of preserving the academic integrity of the game and to preserve things like Chatham House rules and that type of thing. I keep them out of adjudication unless they're there specifically for a walkthrough, and that has to be coordinated with me well in advance. I often use that opportunity to make fun of them when they come to adjudication, because what they'll see in adjudication isn't a lot of high-end modeling and simulation, but a lot of people just doing some hard thinking and maybe using some probability tables and whatnot to determine outcomes. And my most recent acquisition, so now I'm off on an aside, is a Magic 8-ball that I had custom made the answers, and they all come up with adjudication answers. So what's it saying right now? Oh, this is my favorite one. Fog and friction, ask again. And target destroyed. Now, I happen to know the probabilities associated with all the different answers. And there's 15% neutral outcomes, 35% attack favorable outcomes, 35% defense favorable outcomes, and 15% fog and frictions. But it freaks out senior officers when they see me doing things like, using random number generators, because I don't really understand the nature of random numbers and probability and statistics. But I try to corral them. Okay, so I don't let anybody, especially adjudication, because it's usually where I live in game executions, that nobody wanders into my adjudication cell that either I didn't expect, or that if they do, I'm on them. And I steer them, and I keep them away from my people who are madly working, trying to get an answer out in under tight timeline. So I have a bit of the luxury of excess personnel, so to speak, to really try to get into the management of senior officers who are wandering around. In games which are more structured around senior officers, we have had to do the pullouts where a facilitator has decided that the conversation, the situation in the room is deteriorating to the point where they're going to call a break, and say, hey, everybody, let's just take a break here for 10, go fill up your coffee cups and whatnot, and then we pull out the problem causer, regardless of rank, and we get with the game director. And if we need to, we invoke our own chain of command to remove them from the game. I hate doing that. I mean, that just generates such bad blood. And we usually try to approach it in a much softer hand at first before it gets to that point. But it's tough, especially in military constructs, because people have that automatic deference to rank type of thing, and I'm old and retired and don't care anymore. So I get away with a little bit more of it in terms of, yeah, whatever. Who's this? Yeah, okay, that's nice. He's a glorified captain. Got it. Kind of thing that, again, I can get away with on a limited basis. But really part of it is, and we do this is one of the things that we do towards the end after we've had the FBC and we're looking at the final, who's coming and when. We sit there and we do our own little what if games. Sit there and go, okay, so what if the Joint Chiefs of Staff shows up and does X? What if we've got a problem player and he's a senior officer? What if, and try to think through that with the core team so that we're postured to immediately respond. And we brief up our chain of command. Hey, this is what we're planning on doing. If Admiral Schmutz gets out of hand, we're planning on having the Chief of Staff come over, and he's agreed that he'll pull him out. It's like, okay, great. So,
Pete, I'm wondering if the other microphones are muted.
Oh, I didn't mute them, did I? Am I? Let me see. Hang on. No, they can unmute themselves. They're just shut. Or something.
Hi, Pete. This is Mark Lino from the Army War College.
Hey, Mark.
Question. So I know it's always a contentious topic, but when you have deliverables for the sponsors after the game, I know it's more than an art than a science, but I'd love to hear your comments on timings, quick report fast, long report later. I'd love to hear your comments on that topic. Thank you.
Yeah, I hate those. Okay, so the quick look. For years, we were able to beat back the quick look. Because there was this constant need, the sense of this appetite for, okay, well, give us your conclusions right away. Because why? Why? Back to why? Why do you need these right away? But we eventually got worn down. And now what we do is, the side story in terms of the quick look. I had one game director once who wrote a quick look that said, the game was scheduled for Monday through Friday. We played the game and people came. More to follow. That was his entire quick look. All right, that was funny. It didn't go over well with senior leadership. So what we do now is we kind of have this format in terms of the initial quick look and what our former CNO, Admiral Richardson, wanted versus the current guy, which I'm not sure what his druthers are, but we haven't had orders to change, was basically the sponsor had to generate the quick look, not the war gamers. Because after all, the game is for them. You know, in theory, when Title 10 wargaming, at least for the United States Navy, it is the CNO who has through his good graces given this gaming capacity to a particular sponsor for us to work on their behalf, because otherwise we all work for him. So he wanted to hear from the sponsor, how did it go? And so we would, of course, we would help. We would craft an email. It was email format that went from the sponsor immediately back to the Chief of Naval Operations that kind of outlined the high level stuff without getting into any analysis. And this is the battle that we're constantly fighting, in that people will want to draw immediate conclusions based on the anecdotal evidence before them. And what they fail to realize is that by and large, nobody's got a full picture of the game yet. None of us were everywhere at the same time to see everything that was said and done. So we all have snapshots of it. I mean, I have a very different view living in adjudication of what quote unquote happened in the game than a facilitator in the blue cell did with regard to his interactions with those players. So all we do in our quote unquote quick look is to give a very high level reportage of the game in terms of, you know, what the game was held, who attended, that's safe, okay, who showed up. In theory, it goes to some issues about, you know, organizations that participated. And, oh, this game is super credible because, you know, Stratcom showed up. So who showed up, what the objectives of the game were, basically, and any initial thoughts. Now, if this is coming, if this is who this goes to, if it's going to the sponsor, this is a slightly different problem. If it's going to somebody who cares, like the CNO, then we get the sponsor's initial impressions. Okay, it's important those are impressions. Now, our next product that we come up with is that we've got what, there's the hot wash, then the quick look, and then our final game report. In the middle, often we have to come up with something that kind of addresses initial findings. And we're just loath to get too much into much detail because we generate a ton. I mean, I'm sure you guys, again, same problem. You generate a ton of information in terms of player move sheets and ethnography notes and move data and all that stuff that you need to sift through. And it's going to take you some time to get through all of it and put it together in a coherent fashion that actually tries to make a sense of the findings. So a lot of it goes, and we try to ground all this back in the research questions because we had questions we were supposed to answer, so to speak. So we tend to try to make sure that all of our reporting is of a nature that goes to those questions. Now, we used to generate reports that were 200 plus pages long. Nobody read those. I wouldn't read it. Good grief. How many pages? And we were padding it because there was the attitude that game reporting was like scientific journal reporting. In that, when someone read my game report, they had to be able to reproduce the game and see if they got the same results. Now, we know that games aren't like that. They're not scientific experiments. But the idea that I had to include a level of detail that would allow someone to look at the game report and basically re-include or to include the game design documentation, all of the move sheets, all of the notes, all of the raw data dump. And it's like, oh, this is crazy. Okay, we're not trying to provide them with the how-to guide to recreate, you know, pandemic 2020. We're simply reporting on the outcome. If someone is interested in how we did the game, we give a super high level, like, you know, not much more than a page of the design and about a half page about how we do adjudication because people are always interested in whether I use magic 8 balls or Ouija boards or what I did. I got some Chinese fortune sticks I keep at the office for the same reason. We keep that at super high level. And then we basically get into the research questions. Here were the questions that this game was intended to address. Did we? What did we learn about those questions? Okay. Also in the past, we were reluctant then to push recommendations because again, this was a one-time, you know, a game, artificial, looked at it, has certain players, a lot of constraints and restraints that were imposed upon a game and its generalizability. A lot of people want massive generalizability out of a war game. You run it once, and now they want you to be able to say that, yes, this war game predicts victory in the Pacific. Dude, we ran one game with one set of players. I don't know that that's going to tell you that. Well, that's what we need to know. Sorry, we'll have to play this game a lot more before we start to see some trends maybe, or begin to understand what we call the irrecoverable, irreversible actions that we probably ought not take in actual conflict. But we really kind of try to drive home this idea of we're answering the research questions. And we're doing that based on a very clear evidentiary train of player actions. So it's not what we think from the war college perspective. It's the players said. We do a lot of the players said. The players said, the players did. And this leads us to believe that. Highly unlikely, likely, could be, possible, you know, whatever type of squishy qualitative language I want to use towards the end. But it's not dissimilar to the structure of, if you've ever been, I was an aircraft mishap investigator for a while. And where you have to take this evidentiary train, where basically you have a thing, right? You piece of evidence. Okay, I got a broken throttle quadrant. I've got a bent flap. I've got a thing in front of me. Okay, I've got a finding of fact. So I've got evidence and findings of fact. And I then have to draw conclusions based on the evidence and finding of fact that I've presented. So I can't make a conclusion that isn't founded in some preceding piece of evidence or finding of fact. And you had to number stuff and show that pull through, okay? So I can't say that the pilot looked like the pilot was not proficient at this particular maneuver. It's like, well, where'd that come from? There's nothing in the finding of fact or evidence to suggest that. Now, if I say, oh yes, I had his training jacket, finding of fact number one, training jacket showed he had not done this type of maneuver for a year and a half. Evidence piece of two, on a debrief sheet from a previous flight, he was cautioned against doing this type of maneuver. Okay, now I can start to make the case. We do the same thing in a war game report. You try to make the case saying, look, this is what the player said and did. Therefore, these are the conclusions we're trying to draw relative to the research questions we were tasked, or we self-tasked, because we came up with research questions in concert with the sponsor, to answer. And try to build it that way. So our initial reporting might just be the evidentiary pieces, because we haven't had time to pull it all together. You know, initial evidence is blah. I'm not saying what my conclusions are yet. Now, I'm certainly not making any recommendations at this stage. But this is where I am in my build out. Because if you build it that way, player findings, player statements, player actions and player statements first. It's the first thing you need to get your head around. And then from those, start looking at some of the player, you know, like maybe you did some surveying, you know, some activity outside of the game per se, and you ask for player observations, you ask for player insights, maybe get some plenary stuff, right? But I'm not going to spring all that out there until I've walked the dog from what they did, what they said, what they thought, how it relates to my questions, how I can make some conclusions. I might be able to make some general recommendations, but that's kind of the structure. So early reporting is simply kind of where you draw the line and give them what's above the line at that point, okay? Because at least then they're not getting, what we hate is when people jump basically to the conclusions and start there, okay? From a reporting position, you know, it's been a whole, it's been a day. Game ended on Friday. Monday we show up and somebody's already put out something that says that the war game in Newport last week proved something. I go, where did that come from? Okay, we haven't even sifted through the data yet. And yet someone's claiming it proved something. Yeah, from their perspective, it probably reinforced a position that they came to see succeed in the game. So they're happy to put it out there early. And that's why we're also somewhat low, though we can't stop people, though we're starting to think about this, about NDAs. And actually having to get into the non-disclosure world to prevent early inappropriate reporting. Usually where our problem comes is our classification. It is rare now that I'm gaming below top secret, if not top secret, and into compartmentalizations and special programs. So we got a serious interest in controlling the information that comes out of those sorts of games. But there's always going to be an appetite to know what happened now. And one of our concerns about early reporting is it becomes the only reporting. Meaning it's the only thing people read. So out comes some sort of early quick look thing, summarizes the game, and threw out some initial thinking. I hope it didn't. And someone later says, oh, the global 10 report is out. And they go, I read the quick look, I got it. Oh, the story has changed 180 degrees from the quick look. And the example I always use in this case was a game that we did with the Marine Corps years ago. And it was about the perennial problems of command and control between the Marine Corps and the United States Navy and the amphibious environment. All right. So when you're at sea, everyone pretty much so agrees, yep, the Navy's running the show. When all the Marines are ashore, we pretty much so agree the Marines are running the show. Well, what about that sloppy transition time? And what are the best ways to arrange people to do that? And how should we command and control that environment? So we had a game event with our Marine Corps brethren, and it was contentious. The Navy came with the Navy answer, and they were not going to move off that answer. Marine Corps showed up, the Marine Corps answer, and they were dug in. So the initial findings in that game looked pretty pessimistic. If you had just walked out of that game thinking, well, there was 3 days of nothing, all right, we learned nothing out of that. That was a complete waste of time. Later, took us a couple weeks, as we started pouring through the data, we actually found in various player statements and surveys and actions and whatnot, not a common ground in terms of something that both sides liked, but we found something that both sides didn't dislike, that they could tolerate. And when we presented that back to the sponsor, they all kind of went, oh, well, you're right. I don't love that idea. And it's not my first choice, but I could live with it. And the Marine Corps said the same thing. And we went, huzzah! Now, if you'd only read the quick look, you would never have known that we had found something interesting. And yet that's the danger. People want to know now. And I'm not sure why they want to know now. I think it's just the impatience of humans. Because usually we ask, is there other events that this is informing? Because if you're trying to take this war game result and dump it into your acquisition timeline, or you've got a POM cycle coming up, or you've got some other big decision that's being informed by this game, I need to know that back in the CDC. So we understand that, and we actually help you deliver relevant information in a timely fashion to meet those external deadlines. But I need to know that up front. We just went through this drill over the summer, the Joint Staff, and they have a report, had a report, COVID kind of changed everything, had a report that had to go to the SecDef on 1 December. And that was driving everything. This 1 December report to the SecDef. And we started to peel back on, well, why does it have to be 1 December? I mean, who came up with that date? And heaven forbid, once you brief a flag officer or a senior executive and you put it on a PowerPoint slide, it is unchangeable. Right? PowerPoint is like concrete. Once it's been briefed that way, people are like, oh, we can't change it. We already briefed this date. It's like, well, you just picked it out of the thin air. Why can't you pick a different date out of thin air? Oh, because we've already put it on a PowerPoint slide. Those are editable. So I feel your pain when it comes to quick looks and people want answers now. But that's kind of the approach we've tried to take, is always relate everything to the research questions and start with the most simple evidentiary type of information first and build towards the more complex conclusions and recommendations, which are held for later. Don't jump to those just because someone's squealing for them. Usually if you give them something, you'll shut them up.
Thank you very much, sir. Appreciate it. It's always an interesting question for us too, so I appreciate your thoughts on it. So, but just in short, I know, different games, different timelines, but would you agree that generally the longer term things, you need to get them done in 6 months or less? Like I find that if these things take too long, sometimes it's just no longer relevant. Would you agree?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Matter of fact, our timeline is typically 30 days.
Okay.
From when the game ends, depending upon the complexity, sometimes we need to go to 60. Usually the 60-day reporting timeline is if we have to get into the world of declassification, and we've got other people who are going to have to look at our stuff and say, yes, that's releasable. No, that's not. That's going to add time. But at the simplest approach is we give ourselves 30 days. That's like the minimum. And then from there, we'll typically have to argue for 60, and most often we can get it. But yeah, we've got to be inside of 2 months. 2 months from the end of game to having the game report distributed, endorsed, whatever. That's the maximum we'll go.
Thank you very much, sir.
It is the bottom of the hour. I hate to cut people off, but unless there's a burning desire to talk about something. But I think that's it. Okay. So again, as always, thanks for dropping in on these. Robert's my agent. So if there's another topic, we do have a couple other ones out there that we're batting around. I have been asked to do one about PowerPoint, actually. And the relevancy in terms of effective use of PowerPoint isn't because I'm trying to make you all visual designers, but if you've just done a war game and you've got something important to tell and you use PowerPoint poorly, your valuable information will be lost. I don't care whether they're talking about war game results, the results of your research, or any other information. If it's worth sharing, it's worth communicating effectively. And most use of PowerPoint is dreadful. It's not PowerPoint's fault. It's our fault. Well, there's a part I do blame on Microsoft, but that's a potential topic. I've been asked to do it. I do it for local universities, especially for students who are getting ready to present projects and reports and whatnot, to make sure they just don't make a hash of it because of poor PowerPoint skills. And it has nothing to do with memorizing a bunch of rules about how many bullets you're allowed to have or how many words can be on a slide. That's almost the wrong approach. But that's a topic in the offing. I'm working on that for another university, and that's something that we can throw out here as well. I know there's some interest in that, plus other wargaming topics that we can certainly pick at future time. So, Robert, unless you've got something else.
Oh, no, it's just that it will be recorded, and eventually,
Yep.
when it's posted, you'll have access to the link.
Okay. All right. I'll stop the recording.